Midnight Mess by Jack Oleg, narrated by Chris Harvey. The hotel room suited Rogers's personality perfectly. Third-rate and completely nondescript. It smelled faintly of dust and stale linen, and yet it had not yet quite surrendered to mediocrity. Once elegant, it wore its shabbiness like a badge of defiance. The defiance was a kind of bitter, desperate miasma that hung in the air, desperate and yet with a tinge of hope. Time and lack of money had set their mark on the room, but more time and enough money could erase that mark, and so it was with Rogers. He did not think of it in quite that manner, of course, but the thought was in his mind as he took his necktie from where it had been carelessly tossed on the scratched desk of drawers and slipped it under his shirt collar. Money. A man was nothing without money. But soon. The thought left him. Outside, in the corridor that smelled even more strongly of dust than did the room in which he stood, someone was moving. He could hear footsteps approaching along the corridor, and the footsteps were familiar. Yet even so he did not go to the door at once. The footsteps sounded as though they might belong to Clive, but he could not be certain. It was best, at this stage of the game, that he show himself to as few people as possible. Squinting unconsciously so that his face took on the look of a ferret's, he turned to face the door. The knock, when it came, made him draw in his breath. With one motion he whipped the still unknotted necktie from under his collar and tossed it back onto the chest of drawers. He was ready, but even then he did not immediately answer the knock. Still careful, he crossed to the door and stood with one hand poised above the chain latch that secured it. "Clive? Who else?" There was no mistaking the voice, but when he opened the door it was only far enough so that he could see into the corridor. In the corridor, Clive smiled his oily smile and then, when the door swung wide, walked into the room without speaking. A big man, he took 3 steps and then turned to face Rogers, and if Rogers had about him the look of a ferret, Clive had about him the look of a lynx. "Well?" Rogers had closed the door behind him and his voice was impatient. He did not like Clive. Clive was too shrewd, too wise, but he needed him, at least for now. Clive's smile widened into a grin. Men like Rogers were no novelty to a private investigator. Such men always had something to hide, and a man who has something to hide can almost always be bullied. He did not bother to answer when Rogers glared at him and spat the word again. "Well?" Instead, he moved leisurely to where a bottle of whisky and 2 glasses stood on a night table. Carefully, elaborately, enjoying his moment, he poured himself a drink and raised his glass as if in a toast. To Rogers the gesture was maddening. His question was almost a snarl. "Well, did you find her?" Clive's nod was slow, deliberate. "Where?" Savouring the moment, prolonging it, Clive sipped from his glass, then shifted the glass from his right hand to his left. His right hand, freed, lifted until it was just under Rogers's nose, fingers rubbing together in a circular motion that has but one meaning whenever men gather in to discuss business. Cursing inwardly, Rogers produced his wallet. The wallet was crammed full. He had had to beg and borrow in order to accumulate what it contained, but it was almost empty when he had paid Clive his fee. The detective's eyes had widened at the sight of the stuffed wallet, but he made no comment. When he had counted the bills that Rogers had given him and stowed them away in his pocket, he produced a small slip of paper. "That's where she lives." Waterville? The address scribbled on the paper meant nothing to Rogers. "It's about 200 miles north of here." For a moment Clive hesitated. One did not, in his profession, admit to fear, however tenuous. Still, his fee had been a generous one. It made him feel expansive. I didn't like the town at all. It's a peculiar place. Strange. I got out of there as fast as I could. If I were you, you aren't." Rogers had not really heard him. He was staring at the slip of paper and his hands were trembling. "I'm more interested in what we discussed in your office. Nobody knew I hired you?" "Nobody." "And nobody saw you come here?" "Nobody." This time the detective's voice was almost aggrieved. "I'm good at my job? Everything confidential? That was what you wanted, wasn't it?" "Yes." Rogers, his back still to the door, seemed satisfied. "Yes, it was." But when he moved away from the door to shake Clive's hand, there was no mistaking his meaning. The meeting was over. "Thanks. Any time." Rogers, Clive was thinking, was an odd one. He had hoped to linger, to talk, perhaps to gain some inkling of what Rogers was up to. There was often profit in such information, but Rogers was obviously anxious to be rid of him. "Well, so long." He had already forgotten Rogers by the time he had placed his hand on the doorknob. He was thinking of other things, of the money that Rogers had given him. It made a comfortable bulge in his pocket, and he was content. He did not see Rogers behind him pluck his necktie from the chest of drawers. He did not see Rogers come after him. The first inkling that he had of what was about to happen was the feather-like touch of the necktie as Rogers looped it about his throat, a touch that was almost instantly transformed into a gagging, choking pressure that constricted his windpipe like a noose, that cut off the flow of air to his lungs, that made his eyes bulge as he fought vainly to claw the necktie from his throat. In seconds his tongue was protruding between his writhing lips and his face was blue, but still he fought. He fought as only a man on the threshold of extinction can fight, his body flopping like the body of a hooked fish, and it was hopeless. Rogers too was fighting for something that only he knew about, and he hung on like grim death, every muscle in his body straining, his breath coming in great gasps, until, presently, Clive's fingers were plucking only weakly at the necktie, until at last his arms fell helplessly to his sides and he hung limply from the noose and then slumped to the floor, collapsing in on himself like a broken marionette, and lay purple-faced and open-mouthed with his bulging eyes glaring sightlessly up at the ceiling. For a long moment Rogers stood staring down at him, his own face still distorted with the strain of his effort. It was over. After a while he smiled. It had really gone quite well. He was pleased and calm when he removed the money from Clive's pocket and returned it to his wallet. So much for that. The clerk behind the desk in the lobby gave him barely a glance when he left the hotel, and that pleased him too. In all the time that he had been registered at the hotel, under a false name of course, the clerk had seen him only once, on the night when he had checked in. There would be no identifying him when Clive's body was found. He had, in fact, no further interest in Clive. Clive had served his purpose. Now there were more important matters to attend to. A half hour later he was at the bus terminal. Minutes after that he was on his way. It seemed to him, as the bus rolled through the bright afternoon, that its wheels made a kind of song. They seemed to be humming a single word over and over again. Money, 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 money. In time, completely at peace with himself and with his world, completely without conscience or regret, he slept. It was the bus driver who wakened him. "Waterville, mister." The bus was no longer rolling by then, and he could see daylight through the window, so that for an instant it seemed to him that he had only just closed his eyes. But the lengthening shadows outside belied the thought. Emotionally exhausted, he had slept away the journey. "Oh, thanks." Stiffly he left the bus and started uncertainly as the engine coughed into life and the bus moved off. Waterville, whatever its other attributes, was scarcely a booming metropolis. The street on which he stood was deserted, and so still that it might have been the main street of a ghost town. Not a car, not a pedestrian was visible, and the stores that lined the street, he noted without really thinking about it, were shabby and neglected looking. It was as if the town had reached a certain point in its development and then stopped. Here and there windows had been replaced by plywood, and the walls of the buildings that he passed as he walked were scabrous and peeling with paint. Despite himself, he shivered. There was an atmosphere about the town, a feel that would have been more appropriate to an ancient cemetery, a sense of decay. He shook himself. Not knowing in which direction to walk, he had walked in the direction in which he had been facing when the bus left, and at the corner he almost laughed aloud at his luck. The chipped enamel street sign at the corner bore on one of its scarred arms the name of the street that was scribbled on the scrap of paper that Clive had given him. The coincidence boded well for what he had yet to do. Still, as he walked on, he could not shake off the sense of foreboding. The town was too quiet. Nothing, no sign of life. Not even a stray dog or cat gave evidence that it was inhabited. Perhaps that was why, when he stood at last before the house he sought, he hesitated. He could not have said. The house, as neglected as all the others that he had passed, stood dark and silent in the deepening gloom, and for a while he merely stood on the empty street and stared at it. But he had not come this far only to let vague premonitions deter him now. Eventually he climbed the few brick stairs that led up to the front door and rang the doorbell. Nothing. No sound, no lights. Nothing. Damn! She's not home! Twice more, petulantly now, he pressed the doorbell and heard it ring somewhere deep inside the house. But no one came. Disgusted, he retraced his steps down the stairs to the pavement. He reeled as he turned to walk back the way he had come and collided violently with a man who had been hurrying along the street. Startled, he let out a small, mewing sound of fear. "Sorry!" The man he had run into was staring at him out of an ugly face, but despite his ugliness he did not seem threatening. Embarrassed by his involuntary whimper of fear, Rogers waved a deprecating hand. "No harm done." "Good." The man almost turned away, but not quite. Something seemed to impel him to stare again at Rogers. "You're a stranger in town, aren't you?" The tone of the question, tense, fearful, froze the "yes" in Rogers's throat. "So?" The man offered no explanation. His head tilted as he looked up at the now almost black sky and then back again at Rogers. "So it's getting dark. You'd better get inside somewhere." "Inside?" Rogers did not know that there was a tremor in his voice. "Why?" He was speaking to himself. The man was already half a dozen paces away and walking rapidly down the street. At the corner, where an electric sign glared garishly above a store window, he made a turn and vanished. Rogers, looking after him, swallowed hard. His mouth, for some unaccountable reason, was suddenly dry. He was not aware, when he noticed the sign, that he gasped almost with relief. The sign had been there all the time. It spelled out simply "restaurant," but now that he was aware of it, it was, all at once, a refuge, a haven. All at once he had had enough of this too-still street with its reaching shadows and its old houses with dark windows that seemed to watch him where he stood. Hurrying, he fled from the shadows and almost burst into the restaurant, so that the two diners who were already there looked up, startled as he entered. There were only two of them, a man and a woman, seated together at one of the small tables and reflected in the floor-to-ceiling mirror that covered one entire wall of the place. Their eyes, as they turned towards the door, were frightened. Then, as if reassured, they returned to their coffee. Rogers, after that first meeting of eyes, ignored them. The sudden uneasiness that gripped him on the street seemed laughable here in the light, and his lip curled as much with contempt for his own skittishness as for the surroundings in which he found himself. Old-fashioned and drab, with heavy drapes hanging from its papered walls and small lamps perched anachronistically on its cloth-covered tables, the restaurant might have been lifted bodily out of the Victorian era and plunked down here intact. His nostrils twitched with the distaste as he surveyed it. But any port in a storm? This was as good a place in which to kill time as any other. Completely himself again, he walked to one of the tables and seated himself, and if the chair onto which he dropped was hard, if the outdated water pitcher and goblets on the table beside the ridiculous lamp made his lip curl again, at least there were no shadows here, no mysterious ugly men with frightened eyes. But there was someone else. Where he had appeared from, or when, Rogers could not guess. But suddenly there was a waiter standing beside him, a waiter who looked to be at least 70, who wore a dingy white apron tied about his scrawny middle, and who looked down at him with expression out of watery blue eyes that were not frightened but only cold. It was an effort for Rogers to keep a quiver from his voice. The waiter's sudden appearance was disconcerting, to say the least, but he managed, "I'd like a menu, please." The watery blue eyes did not flicker. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're just about ready to close." "Close?" Roger's own eyes, when he glanced at his wristwatch, left no doubt of his annoyance. But it's almost dinner time. You can't close just before." "It's getting dark." The old man said it matter-of-factly without emphasis, but his tone was final. "We always close before dark. Our help won't stay after sundown." "But what? They have to be home before it gets dark." Again the old man's tone was matter-of-fact, and yet, in that very matter-of-factness, there was something that made the hackles rise on the back of Rogers's neck. It was as if the words were spoken by rote, as if he were being told something that he should already know. Pardon me." The waiter had noticed that the other diners had finished and were waiting for their check. When they had paid it and the old man had pocketed their tip and helped them into their coats, their haste to leave was obvious. Rogers's mouth was dry again. He did not wait for the waiter to return to him. Instead, he went to the door, where the old man waited expectantly. Clearly he was expected to leave too. "All right," he said harshly. "What the devil is this all about? Why is everyone here so afraid of the dark?" "Why?" The waiter might have been an adult speaking to a child. "They come out at night. Everyone knows that." Not looking back, he moved away, towards the drapes at the rear of the restaurant. Who? Who comes out?" The drapes parted as the waiter passed between them, flattered and fell back into place. Left alone, Rogers refrained from following only by a conscious effort of will. He was angry, infuriated by what he considered to be the old man's rudeness, but following would have served no useful purpose. And there was, too, his apprehension. At the core of his anger there was still the seed of that apprehension, a seed that had taken root in him almost as soon as he had left the bus, and that had been growing ever since. His anger took him almost to the drapes behind which the old man had vanished. There his apprehension stopped him. To blazes with the old man, he had other fish to fry. Muttering, he left the restaurant. On the street, he was momentarily disoriented and stopped to take his bearings. Darkness had set in earnest, and except for the ragged pool of light cast by the restaurant's electronic sign, the blackness was absolute. No overhead lights illuminated the facades of the silent houses that he had passed on his way to the restaurant, and the street was empty of traffic as before. Only the electric sign made an island of brightness in a world of shadows, and suddenly that too was gone as the sign went dark. Blind, he could only stand where he was until his eyes had accustomed themselves to the night. Then, purposefully, he set off down the street. He had already wasted too much time, straining to pierce the blackness he sought for and found again the brick stairs at the foot of which he had had such a fright. He took them two at a time, and a moment later was fumbling along the door jamb for the bell. When he had located it, he pressed it hard and did not take his finger from the button. There had been no lights on in the house as he approached, and none went on as the bell sounded again somewhere inside, but eventually his ringing brought results. He could hear a woman's footsteps just behind the door. The footsteps came to a halt. "Who's there?" The voice that sounded through the door was nervous, afraid, a girl's voice. Rogers's smile in the darkness made him look more than ever like a ferret. "It's me, Harold, your brother." "Harold?" Incredulity tinged the voice now, and his smile congealed. "That's right, Donna, Harold. Remember?" The last word was said acidly. He and Donna had never been close, far from it, but even so, her incredulity stung. Slowly, the door opened. An inch or so, no more. "Come in, quickly." When he moved forward, the door opened wider, but only enough so that he could slide through into the hall beyond. Whatever the web of fear that had enmeshed the people of Waterville, it had not spared Donna, and when he was inside she did not at once speak to him. Instead, she closed the door hurriedly behind him and slammed home the sliding bolt that had been attached to its inner side. Only then, still silent, did she lead the way to the living room, and only then did she switch on a lamp. By its light, Rogers surveyed her with ill-concealed amazement. Donna had never been vivacious. He had, in fact, always considered her to be dull. As a child, she had been solitary and withdrawn, only rarely joining in play with her peers, and even more rarely given to laughter, but she had been rather attractive. That attractiveness was no more. Something about her, he could not quite put his finger on, was different. She was afraid, that was obvious, but there was more to it than that. There was a greyness about her, a lack of spark, as if she had permitted her fear to make her old before her time. Aware of his inspection, she endured it, and then said, "So you found me at last." The remark was prosaic, pointless, but it was just about what he had expected from her. He smiled into her eyes and found them as he had always found them, lustreless, almost stupid. It took a long time. His stare took in the room, drab, worn. Trust Donna to wind up in a place like this. She had no flair, no zest for living. Small wonder that they had never been close. "What do you want?" That too was like her. No finesse, no circumspection. Stupid. "I just wanted to see you. After all, you are my sister." Again his eyes flicked about the room. Now that he was here, he was in no great hurry, and he was curious, even if she was not. "Why did you bury yourself in a place like this? And why all the precautions? Why is everyone so afraid of the dark around here?" It seemed to him that she might faint. Her fear, whatever had caused it, was real. That much was certain. "Because of them," she said, and it was a whisper. "Them?" He asked the question tolerantly, amused, but her reply wiped the amusement from his face. "The vampires," Donna said. "They come out at night." "Vampires?" The word fell from his open mouth like a stone. "You're not serious?" In a moment Donna would smile, reveal the joke. "How can anyone in his right mind believe—" She did not smile. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as the old waiter's voice had been flat and matter-of-fact. "There have been several cases so far. All of them happened in or near the town. 17 bodies found, with every drop of blood drained out of them." "I don't believe it. You're making it up." It had to be a joke. He fastened on the thought, clung to it, and accepted it. To do anything else would have been insanity. "You believe what you like." Donna's eyes, those lacklustre, stupid eyes, had widened as she spoke. It was as though she were seeing horrors that he could not even imagine. But she did not press the point. "I've told you the truth. Now suppose you tell me why you're so anxious to find me. Why are you really here?" "Oh, why not? You're my sister." No, that would not do. Not even she would believe that he had come out of family affection, and there was really no reason for pretense. He took a deep breath. Father died 4 weeks ago. That should have brought a response. He waited, but whatever the terror that gripped Donna, it seemed to have drained her. Beyond a slight tightening of her lips, she showed no emotion. "I've been looking for you ever since. You were his heir, you know." Rogers paused, and when he went on there was in his voice a tinge of faintly remembering long-ago bitterness. "You always were his favourite. He didn't care for me at all." "Well, should he have?" "No, I suppose not." Other memories were crowding in on him. Memories of his own inadequacy, of his father's disappointment in him. Memories that made him squirm. He put the memories out of his mind, relegating the past again to oblivion. "Anyway, he left everything to you." Suddenly his tone was vicious. Donna was backing away from him. "Everything. It's all yours. But only—" His hand dipped into his coat pocket. "For as long as you live." The last word was slightly accented, just a touch, but there was no mistaking his meaning. No, you wouldn't," Donna said, and backed away still further as his hand reappeared. In the hand there was a wicked-looking switchblade. "You wouldn't," she whispered again, and remained rooted, fascinated. "Wouldn't I?" The click of the blade as it snapped into view made a counterpoint to his words. Long and deadly, the blade was a serpent's tongue reaching for her. Had she screamed then, had she pleaded, he might at least have hesitated. But she did not scream. She did not plead. Her tongue seemed paralyzed, and only her eyes moved, darting wildly, and it was her eyes that galvanized him, those dull, stupid eyes that he had always found so irritating, that triggered in him all of his old resentments, all of the petty jealousies of his childhood. "Wouldn't I? Not even for money?" "Oh, but you're wrong, Donna," he said, and lunged. She did scream then. She screamed a high-pitched, keening scream that tore at his eardrums as he leapt forward, a scream that echoed from the walls, sounded from the ceiling, and died as he drove the knife into her breast and twisted it. For a moment they made a frozen tableau. Then, a moment after that, she sagged, limply. But even then Rogers did not release his grip on the knife. He had to be sure. And so he held on, forcing the blade deeper and still deeper. When she fell, he fell with her and was hardly aware that he did so. How long he lay there, he could not have said. Donna's screams had unnerved him, and for a time they made a grisly tangle of arms and legs on the cold floor, the living and the dead. Then, gradually, he regained control of himself. When he stood up, he left the knife protruding from Donna's breast. Its bone handle glinted dully in the glow of the lamp. Innately cold and unfeeling, he could even, after a while, smile the same small, satisfied smile that he had smiled after killing Clive. Sister or stranger, it mattered little really. What mattered was success. In this world, the strong fed on the weak, the clever on the stupid, and the devil take the hindmost. His ferret's eyes were glittering as he left the house. A few more hours and he would be back in the city, and no one the wiser. But there were still those hours. A glance at his watch — he had to bring the watch close to his eyes in order to make out its hands — showed him that it would be another 45 minutes before he could expect the next city-bound bus. He would have to wait somewhere. But where? At the foot of the brick stairs he hesitated, uncertain as to what direction to take, and then stared in surprise. Far down the street, at the corner, there was the same ragged pool of light that had been there before. The restaurant sign had been turned back on, and by its glow he could see 3 couples as they approached the restaurant and vanished inside. A few moments later, curious, he stood outside the restaurant and then, with a shrug, moved toward the door. Why not? He was hungry, and there was still that 45 minutes. There was little risk involved. Donna, he smiled again, and this time his smile was a smirk. Donna was hardly in a position to give an alarm. The smirk still twitched at his lips when he threw open the door and, just inside, paused again, amazed. The restaurant, except for 1 or 2 tables that were not in use, was packed, alive with the muted sounds of conversation and laughter. Except for the old-fashioned look of the place, he might have been back in the city, in a fine eating place where well-dressed men and women ate and sipped their red wine and conversed in soft tones. Someone had even drawn the drapes across the mirrored wall so that the restaurant seemed smaller, more intimate. Delighted, he went to one of the empty tables and seated himself, his mouth watering as the savoury aromas of steaming soup and roasts assailed his nostrils. He had not, he remembered, eaten since morning, and he was famished. Eagerly he sought for a waiter and spied one at another table. "Waiter! In a moment, sir." The waiter was not the old man whom he had seen earlier. This one was younger, taller, but his tone was as punctiliously polite as the old man's had been. Satisfied, Rogers settled himself to wait, smiling again as he recalled what Donna had told him. Vampires. Ridiculous. And yet there was something about this town, even about the people who surrounded him. Of course, the people. Suddenly he was frowning. The restaurant was old-fashioned, but so were the people. Well-dressed and well-behaved as they were, there was still a wrongness about them, a variation from the norm. Their clothing, that was it. Here and there he could see a woman's hairdo that was 40 years behind the times, and their costumes. He could just vaguely remember when women had worn long coats with fair colours, when men had worn ridiculously wide-shouldered, double-breasted jackets and pleated trousers. But that had been so long ago, when he was still a boy, when— "Good evening, sir." The waiter to whom he had called had come to his table, and the waiter's appearance too was a shock. Gaunt and tight-lipped, he seemed almost sinister. Sinister. Roger shook himself. He was letting his imagination run away with him. Damn Donna and her talk of vampires. But a town like this, out of the mainstream, of course it was behind the times. There were probably 100 more like it tucked away in out-of-the-way corners all across the country, and each with its own particular brand of superstition to add a bit of spice to living. "Good evening." The waiter, he noticed, carried a menu, but the menu was not offered to him. "The table d'hote is very nice, sir," the waiter said. "Juice, soup, roast, dessert, coffee?" "Almost," Rogers responded tartly. Waiters, in his experience, made at least a pretence of offering a choice, but it was really too much to expect decent service in a place like this. "Oh well, sounds fine to me." "Yes, sir." The waiter moved off, vanished between the drapes, and with his going Rogers turned again to his examination of the other diners. They were strange. Almost ludicrous, really. It was as if they, like the restaurant, had been plucked out of another time. Intent on their food and on each other, they seemed blissfully unaware that they looked like dusty antiques, that the world had moved on. Bah! They were all fools like Donna. Only fools would choose to live in a backwater like this. A footstep behind him made Rogers look up. The waiter had returned with a small glass on a fluted silver tray. "Ah, tomato juice." "Sir?" The waiter was staring at him curiously. Rogers ignored him. Whatever the reason for the waiter's curiosity, it was obviously as inane and meaningless as everything else that he had heard in this godforsaken little village. Hungry, he sipped his juice. It was peculiarly flavoured and too thick, almost cloying, but he drank it down. "Your soup, sir?" Somehow, in the few moments that it took Rogers to finish his juice, the waiter had been to the kitchen and back. The tray that he carried now was bigger than the one he had carried previously, and on it there was a large steaming soup tureen. Handling it with the ease of long practice, he set the tureen on the table and deftly filled Roger's dish. "I hope you enjoy it, sir." After the cloying juice, Rogers doubted he would enjoy it. The peculiar flavour of the juice still clung to his palate. Nevertheless, the soup did smell delicious, and he could see out of the corner of one eye that a number of the other diners were consuming the same steaming dish with considerable gusto. He brought a spoonful of the liquid to his mouth. Its taste belied the promise of its aroma. "It's somewhat salty, isn't it?" he asked. He had not really expected an answer, but neither was he prepared for the curiosity that immediately reappeared in the waiter's eyes. For some reason that he could not fathom, the curiosity made him uneasy, so that he lifted another spoonful of the soup to his lips, anxious to hide the uneasiness. But the soup really was impossible. It had, like the juice, a peculiar flavour, and he would be double damned if he would be bullied by a waiter, sinister-looking or not. It tastes rather strange," he said. "It is our regular, sir." "Indeed?" Irritation tinged Rogers's voice. "I think I'll do without the soup," he said, and waited for the waiter to comment, to protest. There was no comment, no protest, just a lifting of the eyebrows. "Yes, sir." From somewhere about himself, the waiter produced a pencil and a pad. "And now, sir, how would you like your roast clots? Well done? Medium? Rare?" Rogers's head came up slowly. It seemed to him just for a moment that the waiter had said, "Clots." Roast what?" "Clots, sir. Blood clots." There was no mistaking the curiosity in the waiter's eyes now. It was in plain sight. Curiosity and something else. Suspicion. But Rogers saw neither the curiosity nor the suspicion. Bitter liquid rose in his throat, and he gagged, spewing the liquid back into his dish. Sick, he had to try to rise from his seat. He had to get away, to get outside, to vomit. The waiter's hand was on his shoulder. His bony fingers held Rogers with an iron grip that he would not have thought possible in a man so gaunt, and forced him back into his chair. "Draw the curtains! An intruder!" The waiter's voice came to him above the sound of his own retching, but changed, metallic. At the sound of it, all conversation ceased. The sudden silence that filled the room was the silence of the tomb. For a single impossible moment, the silence pressed against Rogers's eardrums. Then, moving swiftly and yet without hurry, several of the diners left their tables. In seconds, the drapes that had hidden the mirrored wall had been drawn back along their rollers to cover the restaurant's windows, and thick folds of cloth barred any visual contact with the outside world. So quickly had it all happened, so suddenly, that Rogers had remained frozen, still gagging. Only the pain in his shoulder released him finally from his sick trance. It required all of his strength, but somehow he managed to stand up. Twisting and squirming, he wrenched free of the waiter's grip and stood so at bay, not yet quite certain what was taking place. He was not to be left long in doubt. His squirming, when he stood erect at last, had turned him about so that he faced the huge floor-to-ceiling mirror. He could see his own reflection, even marvel for a single heart-stopping instant at the way his face had contorted with fear, and then the real horror washed over him. He could see his own reflection, but not the reflection of the others. The mirrored images of the chairs and of the tables at which the others had been seated were all clearly visible, but nothing else. Except for himself, the restaurant, at least in the mirror, was empty. It wasn't happening. It was a nightmare. The realization that had begun to ring alarm bells in his shocked mind could not be true, but there was only one way to make certain. Trembling, dreading what he would see, he turned, and they were all there. The waiter, the other diners, all of them. They stood in a solid phalanx between him and the door, even as he stared, even as the horror became a solid, palpable thing inside him. The phalanx parted and a woman pushed her way toward him through the crowd. "Donna!" His lips formed the words, but no sound came out. Not yet. That was to come a moment later, when Donna stopped before him. She held up the switchblade that he had left implanted in her breast and tossed it contemptuously aside. She opened her mouth to smile. He saw her long needle-sharp fangs. He gaped stupidly at the others, and they too opened their mouths to reveal their fangs. The scream that burst from his lips then was a gasping, ululating howl of pure terror. But who was there to hear? The scream faded, became only a mumbling gargle, as the crowd swept toward him and seized him and lifted him high overhead. It was at that moment, mercifully, that he fainted. So he was not aware, a few moments later, when the restaurant took on a festive air, and filled wine glasses were passed out among the crowd, and the man nearest him lifted a glass to his lips and sipped appreciatively and said, "Delicious! Nothing like the real stuff. Nice and fresh. Excellent." He did not even see Donna when she too extended a hand and said, "I'll have a glass too, please." He regained consciousness only when she had almost finished her drink, and then he did not at once understand. In the little time that he had been unconscious, the world had turned topsy-turvy. He could see Donna as if through a veil. It was Donna, there was no doubt of that, but she was inverted, upside down, and his dazed brain could not fathom why. Not until he saw his image reflected in the mirror. It was not Donna who was inverted, it was he. He hung head down in the middle of the room, suspended from a rafter, with a wooden beer tap inserted deep into a gash in his throat, and when he could tear his tortured stare away from the mirror, he could make out the man standing beside him and refilling Donna's glass from the tap. Had he been able to scream again then, his scream would have been the scream of a man on the edge of madness. But one does not scream with a beer barrel tap inserted deep into one's jugular vein. So at the end, just before oblivion took him, he could only look silently into Donna's inverted eyes and plead with his own. It was hopeless, of course. But still he tried. Because of that, her eyes were the very last thing he saw. It was strange, but even upside down and inverted, Donna's eyes were no longer stupid. They were not stupid at all. They were sparkling, glittering, as she drank his blood. And then she was laughing, 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 laughing. The silence that filled the room when Rogers had finished his narrative was not like the silence that had permeated the building earlier. It was different, even more profound, as if each of the occupants of the room were locked away in some secret world of his own. Their drinks forgotten, they sat as if mesmerized, not moving. Of them all, only the artist seemed inclined to say anything. His paint-stained fingers clasping and unclasping about his glass, he leaned toward Rogers and spoke softly. "A recurrent dream." Rogers, before he answered, downed his drink and poured himself another with hands that were suddenly trembling. It's more than a dream, much more. For a moment he seemed reluctant to go on, but there was no derision in the eyes of the others. They too were leaning toward him, like sleepwalkers coming awake. It's hard to explain. It seems to be with me all the time, almost as if— "And do you have a sister?" Critchett, no longer bemused by his own thoughts, came directly to the point. No. Rogers's reply had been just a shade too vehement, too emphatic. "Then I think I know what he means." The tall man, almost as seedy as Rogers, spoke half to himself. "Oh, really?" Critchett's voice dripped with uncalled-for sarcasm. "Do tell us." "Tell you?" The tall man's eyes narrowed, became shadowed, as if he too were remembering. "Well, why not? I have a similar vision, a similar fear. Similar, but not quite the same." Harold Rogers's story, Midnight Mess, was written by Jack Oleg and narrated, sound edited and mixed by Chris Harvey. Coming very soon. Stay tuned for even more tales from the chilling depths of the vault of horror, from where I will be bringing you Maitland's fateful story, Bargain in Death. And what a grave tale it is to behold indeed, for it is from the very dark depths of the grave itself, the very pits of the grave itself.